Hello everybody and welcome to our third webinar of the day for the intelligence-led penetration webinars. And we now have a presentation from Ian Glover with regards to intelligence-led penetration testing and the global view. Just before I hand over to Ian, just to go through a couple of things, there will be a chance to ask Ian any questions at the end of this presentation. And for those of you that have been on GoToWebinar before, you know there is a question pane. And for those that haven't, there's a button on the right hand side on your panel which says questions, and you can type your questions into that panel. Please feel free to type them throughout the presentation. And we will try to get those questions asked for you at the end. So now I will not talk anymore and I will hand over to Ian. Thanks, Ian.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Debbie. First of all, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming on to this call. Also, I'd like to thank the previous two presentations. I thought they were both really interesting. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to them, then we are recording all of these presentations and we're going to make them available to everybody. I was asked just to give a sort of global view in terms of some of the activities and things that we're seeing in terms of intelligence-led penetration testing. But I thought it was quite useful just to step back a little bit and think about where it's come from and also the speed in which it's being adopted. So around about 2011, we were looking at some of the output from some of the business continuity planning exercises that were being run across the financial services in the City of London. They have been predominantly orientated around looking at counter-terrorism activity and looking at denial of access to certain banking facilities, again, predominantly due to bombing or due to large-scale sort of infrastructure failure. So it's a very much a physical type activity. In 2011, there was an initiative called Waking Shark, and that was really the first time that elements of cybersecurity related activities were included in terms of those significant cross-organisational activities, really looking at some of the very early elements of resilience planning. Waking Shark was then followed by the imaginative named Waking Shark 2, and that was really a significant move forward. So we as an industry have been pushing for some time to make sure that cyber security related issues were included in these significant resilience exercises. And this was really the first one where this was done in a very consolidated and consistent way. That was still run by business continuity planning people, although we'd started to involve a lot more of the technical people in terms of these types of activities. But again, it hasn't changed that much. We're still looking at a sustained intensive cyber attack at that point. And the results coming from the Waking Shark 2 were really interesting. And they'd made significant progress from the output that had come from 2011, the first time this was run. The agreement at that point was that the Bank of England and other financial service authorities will continue working with the sector to test the collective resilience against a cyber attack, and that this should be a part of an ongoing piece of work. At that point, we tried to look at how the original resilience testing exercises were conducted. And they were single point exercises or single point in time exercises. And we believe that from a cyber related attack perspective, because there were so many different ways the organisations or the overall infrastructure could be attacked, what we needed to do was to have a way of doing these types of exercises in a much more consistent way and to apply the sorts of tools and techniques across a wide range of organisations, systems, functions and critical operations. So really from 2014, we then started work as CREST at that time. Everything before that was in a previous guise. But with CREST in 2015, we started to work with the Bank of England on the development of CBEST, the concept of trying to take that resilience exercising, make it much more resilient, make it repeatable, and make it applicable to a wider range of organisations were the primary areas. At that point in time, the cyber-related threat intelligence was really also coming to a fore, and I strongly believed, and supported by others, that this was really the approach that we should look at. So not only just doing the attack, but also understanding what the threat is, and then actually doing the simulations against real life events. So CBEST was really thought leaders in terms of the Bank of England under the CBEST team were really thought leaders in terms of trying to drive this process through. And we ran a lot of exercises and a lot of workshops to try to incorporate the threat intelligence into this particular process. But also, very importantly, what we wanted to be able to do was to do this to critical operational systems. And certainly what you've seen from the previous presentation, those critical functions and the ability to run quite intrusive or potentially intrusive penetration tests against critical assets was absolutely something that wasn't done at the time. So where we were talking about penetration testing, at that point in time, it was very much on what I'd class as pure operational systems, but not operational critical systems. And the penetration testing teams in particular were kept well away from anything for fear of knocking things over. So we had these two elements. What we needed to do was to think about how to introduce the sort of attack type scenarios from a penetration testing perspective, but do this in a way that we weren't putting critical assets at risk, and at the same time try to incorporate the threat intelligence. And that was really the emphasis behind all of that work. The launch of CBEST went probably better than we all anticipated, and in some ways that actually caused us some difficulties. We launched the documentation in draft, we launched some of the scheme elements in draft, but they were immediately taken up by both people that were part of the regulated environment, but also people outside of it. So very much from the 2015 point, we were playing a little bit of catch up in terms of actually trying to put all the processes and everything else behind it to make sure that we could run this in a consistent way. And whilst we anticipated there would be some international interest, I think we were fairly overwhelmed by the level of interest from regulators in different parts of the world. At that point in time, both the Bank of England and CREST representatives were really travelling the world trying to describe what it was we were doing from a CBEST perspective, and to try to take the good practice and think about how we'd apply it to a much wider and greater audience. The first concerted part of that was working very much with the people in Holland to develop what they were classing as Tiber at that point in time. So we worked very closely with them. I spent quite a lot of time in Den Haag working with the people that were developing the Tiber framework and trying to get over the best practice and trying to learn some of the things we'd had from the original CBEST implementation to make sure that it could be applied in the Netherlands. Really interesting piece of work. At the same time, we were part funded by the Monetary Authority Singapore to establish a CREST chapter, and also the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, so HKMA and HKIB, the International Bankers Association. And they wanted a CREST chapter because they wanted to be in a position to roll out a similar process to CBEST in other areas. The interesting thing at that point was that we also had an awful lot of queries coming through, as the Bank of England did, from countries that wanted to run similar programs. And we were trying to work out how we could implement that on a more global scale. The difficulty we had at that point was the Bank of England had sort of many years of running these types of exercises, both in terms of cyber related, but also more general resilience activities. And then when we spoke to some of the other regulators in other parts of the world, they didn't have that level of experience. They didn't necessarily have the skills in-house that the Bank of England had to actually run these schemes. It was a very brave person in the Bank of England that actually put together the sort of CBEST team to both develop the concept and to implement it. And that wasn't available in different parts of the world. And in addition, some of the community, our financial services was very mature in terms of its resilience, but other parts of the world, really that level of maturity in terms of both the professional organisations that were providing services and also the skills that are available were not as widely available in other areas. So 2016 we thought was a real turn. At that point, ICAST also came on board. Again, that came from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. The main difference of that was that they didn't ask for accredited organisations. They were looking very much at the skill, knowledge and competence of the individuals running those schemes. And my personal opinion is that's sort of delayed the process of maturing that particular marketplace. What we haven't seen is the massive increase in terms of CREST membership in Hong Kong, as we've seen in places like Singapore, and we are seeing in Malaysia, and we're seeing in the US. And I think some of that was an early decision for that ICAST team not to actually include some of the accreditation side. Around about that time as well, we then started to talk to other parts of the critical national infrastructure within the UK. We developed CBEST. I really like CBEST for a number of reasons. We worked very closely with training providers at that point as well, because under the telecommunications area, what we wanted to do is to ensure that the individual attackers were understanding sort of layer 8 technologies and protocols, hard communications protocols, and they understood the sort of differences about attacking a communications environment rather than attacking a sort of operational or finance related organisation. So one of the really good things I thought that came from CBEST was this concept that there might be some additional requirements for different sectors. We're also working with the civil nuclear industry under CBEST, and again we did quite a lot of really good work. Some of the contracts went to our CREST member companies to further develop that, and that's gone very quiet, which I think is a bit of a shame. But I think it'd be very easy to turn some of those things on, and I'll come on to some of the reasons why I think some of those have been delayed. GBEST, which is the government version, came into the UK, and we've got a number of other governments in different parts of the world looking at very similar schemes. I think the Cabinet Office did a really good job of implementing that. They absolutely listened to some of the recommendations that we made in terms of utilising sort of CBEST member organisations, but then making sure that those organisations could actually provide services to government. So we've worked with them very closely to make sure that the procurement process is done in an appropriate way. At the same time, we were developing something called ATTEST, and this was with the Civil Aviation Authority, and this was going to be the regulator version of CBEST for the civil aviation group. That has been put on a slight back burner, and we've moved forward with Assure, which is much more related to the cyber assessment framework that's conducted, and also the NIST directive. So what they've done is they've recognised the real benefits of having the deep dive, but what they wanted to do is to put their house in order first from the sort of more compliance areas. I believe that a test will come back, but it's interesting to see that whilst the financial services has really flown, we've sort of stumbled a little bit, I think, in terms of moving some of these concepts into the other areas of critical national infrastructure. Moving on to sort of 2018, at that point, we were having very strong conversations with the European Central Bank, with ECB. They, for many reasons, decided to adopt a more Tiber-like approach. We were quite comfortable with that because we'd had such a significant input to that, and so did our members. And they came out with the concepts of Tiber EU. That's very different from CBEST. CBEST is very much a regulatory tool. And obviously the guidelines that are coming from the ECB are setting standards that need to be applied in other parts of the European community. So it is different in terms of its structure. And we've obviously been working with ECB for a long time, trying to make sure that the good practices and things from a CBEST perspective are drawn through, but also we can learn some of the new techniques and some of the new approaches that we're seeing coming through from other areas, including Holland, but other places as well. At that time, we also started to see a lot of activity. We did quite a lot of work supported by people in the UK, in Canada, and it's really interesting because they ran some of their early trials, really got some positive feedback, and now they're into their planning for their next phase. Through the European Central Bank, then we're also seeing work being done in Denmark, in Belgium, but also in other areas of the environment. And what we're seeing at the moment is that these countries are beginning to take more and more interest in terms of what's actually happening. And we've been talking to people in Finland, in Germany, in Ireland, in Italy, not so much, but a little bit. We're starting to talk to some of the people in the Nordic regions. We've been over to Romania a couple of times to try to support it, supported by the UK Foreign Office. We've been communicating with the monetary authorities in Chile. We've had the Japanese monetary authority come to the UK 3 times to actually start to build out some of their process. So what we've got is this big influx in terms of both interest, but also some of the regulatory requirements coming through from different countries. And again, I think that maturity in some of these areas is quite interesting in terms of how we actually move things forward. We have, for example, in France, been talking to some of the regulators and some of the government entities that do accreditation and trying to work out how we can have a consistent application across those areas. And then you've got the other standards organisations in Germany that we have been working closely with, but again, they have a slightly different approach. So whilst all these things look very similar, there are nuances associated with how we can deliver these things for the future. Sorry, I'm not sure one way. And as I said, the other big difference, I think, is that the Bank of England are absolutely using this as a regulatory tool, and you should really go away and read the differences between some of the approaches. What we're doing here is looking at how this can be adopted and how it can be run in a slightly different way. I'm very scared to quit. I'm very sorry about this. And what we've done is we've moved forward with the development of StarFS, which is much more like a regulatory tool. So what's happened with the Bank of England in the past is they've had real levels of involvement in all of the activities associated with all the CBEST activities. Obviously, that's very difficult to scale, as Tracy has alluded to in the previous presentation. But also, is moving much more now towards the more traditional regulatory tools that are used by the financial services regulators. And therefore, the implementation of the StarFS, I think, is a massive step forward. And it's really some of the work that we would have liked to have seen done very early in terms of the work we did under CBEST. And now I think we've got a few years worth of experience, but also we are in a much stronger position to be able to deliver these sorts of things in a better way. And as I'm sure you're aware, working with the PRA and working with the FCA, that's extended the number of organisations that fall under the regulatory framework that will fall under the StarFS process. So it's a huge move forward. I think the really interesting thing about putting this slide together was 2011 wasn't actually that long ago, and that was really the rudimentaries of even having a concept in this area. 2014 was the first time really we'd run a more consolidated cyber-related activity, and then around about the 2015 moving forward to now is really where we started to put this in place. Yet what we've seen is a massive global interest in this and a huge amount of industry that's been developed up behind it, and we're seeing the techniques, as has been said by Simon earlier, being adopted by not only the regulated community but also other organisations recognising the benefits. So what is CREST's role in these types of activities? So those of you who are aware of CREST know that our primary aims are building capacity, capability and consistency in the market. And really what we're trying to do here is to support the service supplier community to help them to create the capacity to meet demand. It's always a question that we have whenever we speak to a regulator, is whether or not there is sufficient capacity in the marketplace to actually meet the ongoing demand. And that's only going to grow. We believe that we have to stimulate the professional development activities and career pathways to increase the capability. And there was quite a lot of talk in the previous session about actually building that capability, not just from a technical perspective, but understanding the risks and doing these things in a very controlled way. And then in addition to that, we must help the regulators to share good practice and build schemes that provide a consistent view. What we don't want to do is to have significantly different standards implemented in different parts of the world. That is really going to mess up some of the concepts of key performance indicators and some of the comparatives. And what we need to do is, wherever possible, to have as close as we can a consistent view in terms of the level of assurance that's going to be provided. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges about the internationalization of these particular processes. In addition to that, I strongly believe that we need to stimulate the demand in the C&I sectors and countries. We've been trying for some time to get industry groups together to look at the areas of the critical national infrastructure and move forward in a controlled way. It's almost an apology for me that we haven't been able to do that in quite the way that we envisaged, but I would still really like to have volunteers come forward to help us lead on some of these critical national infrastructure sectors, so that we can push more strongly into the marketplace for our members, but more importantly, to have that consistent view, not only from the financial services, but in other parts of critical national infrastructure. We've got to continue to provide that differentiator in the market for quality service suppliers and suitably skilled, knowledge and competent individuals. And therefore, we've got to support the service supplier community to develop externally validated specialist services. We also need to help our members, but again, this is a significant help with the market, is to open those marketplaces to accredited service suppliers. We are seeing globally the need to actually have some form of external accreditation of organisations. We've seen it in the US under the CMMC, in the US under the Centre for Internet Security work, and we're seeing it under a number of the other schemes. And it's interesting some of the responses we had to the question about why schemes are important in the previous session. And also we need to provide a development pathway for new and developing service suppliers, really helping to make sure that the organisations have a process in place to allow them to mature. So what difficulties do we see? There has been, in terms of the rollout, particularly in continental Europe, but everywhere else, a lack of local accreditation bodies. As CREST being a not-for-profit, we are not looking for international globalization or making sure that we are dominant in the marketplace. We would be more than happy to work with local accreditors, accreditation organisations. And as I've mentioned, we've been speaking to people in Germany and France, both encouraged and supported by the European Central Bank. But really, we haven't seen too many organisations that provide that accreditation service in the same way that we do. So we've developed an international accreditation delivery capability within CREST. The membership portal that Samantha runs is magnificent, and also allows us to do the accreditation in multiple languages. And in addition to that, we've recruited in-country auditors where we do the on-site visits and also some of the technical assessments. The lack of access to examinations and the ability to pass those exams has been quite a perennial problem for us. Again, we would like to work on the equivalencies programs. We have equivalencies for other areas of penetration testing, but we really haven't currently got it at the intelligence-led penetration testing area. So because it's such a small marketplace, it's incumbent on CREST, I believe, to actually deliver those types of examinations in the countries where people can actually do them. And a lot of the work we're doing with the new development platforms actually help on that. Career pathways we are developing in terms of intelligence-led penetration testing, and again there are new examinations that are coming forward which allow that career pathway into the specialist intelligence-led penetration testing areas. So somewhat outside but in support of the penetration testing examination set. There is no equivalence for the threat intelligence from a examination and certification perspective currently. But what we have been doing is we've made sure that all of the threat intelligence certificates are available in Pearson VUE centres globally, and we've been running examinations in more than 50 countries through that Pearson VUE model. And also the CTEPS group, which Rob mentioned earlier, I think has done a really good job in taking a newly formed service line and a newly formed discipline and actually putting career pathways in place for threat intelligence. And that will actually lead to that increase in capacity, whilst ensuring that we maintain the level of quality of individuals. I've mentioned a couple of times the difficulties about the level of regulator maturity to consume it. We developed some maturity model assessments and they were quite informal. to try to encourage countries to go away and look at what they've got in place and then build on those foundations before moving forward with this type of intelligence-led penetration testing work, particularly at a regulated level. We then received some backing and support from the Gates Foundation to look at Africa and Asia. And what that's also provided us with is the opportunity to develop a much more mature maturity model assessment. I won't go into that in too much detail. Samantha's doing a presentation on it this afternoon, but that's actually helped us to start to develop generic guidance, extract best practice, and I think will improve the speed of the implementation and the improvement in terms of the level of maturity. The stage 2 of that Gates project, which we've just started, also provides a pathway to improvement. And what we've done there is we've got significant numbers of new guidance material and new things being developed that will actually support countries to move towards the ability to consume this type of activity. And really importantly, StarFS, the implementation of that, I think is excellent. It's really good. It, as I said, moves much more towards a traditional regulatory tool and requires less regular and active involvement from the regulator, and therefore frees up their technical resources and other resources. So StarFS is really the one to watch, and that's what we're trying to promote in terms of other areas. But what we're doing there is we are, with the support of the Bank of England, develop generic guidance which we can then make available to countries that make the requests. There is a lack of a common approach. A lot of the guidance for these types of schemes is owned at a country level. We can't control that. And in many ways, I quite like it because it makes innovation happen faster. But that generic implementation guide I mentioned is being developed and will be deployed. The reporting guidelines, I still think we need to do a lot more work on. And certainly international KPIs, as Tracy mentioned, I think is a really important aspect. If we can start to do comparisons across countries, and we can start to look at this as a global issue, then I think we can come up with global solutions. Now, I can't stress how important I believe that KPI work is. And then I still believe that we need the nuances between the different parts of the critical national infrastructure. And once we start to use their words and we've matured and provided the tools, I think other parts of the critical national infrastructure globally, particularly under the NIST directive, will start to come on board in much more significant numbers. Finally, I think that there was quite a lot of talk about social engineering, even this morning, but there's always talk about social engineering. And there was quite a lot of talk, particularly from Simon, in terms of ensuring that we stay on the right side of the law. I believe that social engineering as a specialism or a discipline, we need to look at that in a bit more detail. Certainly, some of the questions we've had from certain regulators, even those that haven't adopted the sort of CBEST or STAR process, they do have concerns about some of the social engineering activities that could be associated with doing this type of work. And I think we need to have very clear guidance available, and also we need to understand what social engineering really is. So again, CREST is trying to run some workshops, which we would invite you to actually start to contribute to that work. The final point is how can CREST actually help, or how can you help CREST? We can't be everywhere. I've got a brilliant team that's available to me. I've got really good execs and advisory groups in different parts of the world that provide us a huge amount of support, but we can't be everywhere. So what we need to do is to think about how we can keep informed of new initiatives. And I think the community that's listening to this is out there doing this work. You know, Rob has described the number of projects he's done, as Simon's described how long he's been doing this work in the industry. And what we need to do is to try to gather that information about new initiatives so we can actually be at the forefront and actually start to influence things really as thought leaders. And I think if you provide that information to us, we will work with you. We don't want to work against you. We want to work collaboratively. And therefore, if you pass that information through and work with us, I think you'll be viewed as being very much in the thought leadership area. We have an operational role in CREST where we develop these schemes, we roll the schemes out, we run the certifications, but beyond that development and implementation and that sort of operation of accreditation, we then step away. We don't see the output that comes from the simulated targeted attacks. We don't see the output that comes from the threat intelligence. And therefore we start to get slightly disconnected with the back end of the process. And therefore feedback to us in terms of what you really believe in terms of improvements that could be made, what's working well and what's working badly, how we can improve the guidance, etc., I think would be invaluable. And I think that's a huge benefit to contributing to the common good. And we all benefit from that common good activity. As you can see, we've started in the space of almost 4 years, developed a whole new service sector in terms of providing services in this area. And then finally, what we'd like to do is, if you could provide us with access to the influencers to tell our current story. There's a lot of work being done, particularly looking at equivalencies, for example, in examinations in different parts of the world. And there's a lot of assumptions about what CREST does and what we are currently doing. A lot of that is based on history, not on current practice. And what we really want to do is to make sure that our story in terms of the work we're doing is provided to everybody in a consistent way. And I think that will open up new markets and reduce the need for multiple application processes. So that's really just a very quick run through. I hope that was interesting. Really what I'm doing here is a call for arms. If you can support CREST and you can work with us, I believe we'll all benefit. And there is certainly enough work for everybody to go around. And if we mature this part of the industry, we are not only providing a huge benefit to the different areas where we're actually doing this type of work, but we're also providing an opportunity for individuals and companies to grow. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. Thank you for that informative presentation that you just gave there. We have had a couple of questions in, so I would like to just get those in before we close. So one of them was with regards to the Reserve Bank of Australia. Is there any work going on there with CREST?
So in Australia, we have the strange activity of CREST ANZ no longer working directly with us, but keeping the CREST name, which is a very strange position. But both the membership has been transferred over to CREST International, and also a lot of the relationships now with the Reserve Bank in Australia are now starting to come back on board. So we are actively talking to the Attorney General's office from the government perspective, and we are starting again to talk to the Reserve Bank. We had in the region of about 6 financial organisations all bought into the process of moving towards a CBEST-like activity, but that was some time ago. And what we're now doing is try to reconsolidate that. And I think Nigel Fair, who's our primary representative in Australia, is doing a really good job of reintroducing us. I was out there just before lockdown, and the Reserve Bank was one of the meetings that I actually had cancelled, and I had planned to come out later on in the year as well. So that was 2 trips to Australia. And again, that was to follow up on some of the Reserve Bank activities. I think COVID has definitely slowed things down, but we are talking to them, and I'll keep everybody informed. But again, if people know about initiatives, you're going to be much closer on the ground than we are. Please let us know, and then we can build on it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now, this next question is about, is there anything happening in the USA? Now, I don't think they're talking about the new president. So I think we're going on with CREST's activities that are happening actually in the United States at the moment.
I think from the simulated target attack and response and intelligence-led penetration testing area, the regulators are quite difficult to work with in the US. That's not to say they're difficult. It's just there are so many that it's really difficult to identify who we should be speaking to. And again, I would really like some guidance from our US members. We get a lot of support from our regional advisory board in the US about how we can actually attack some of the major regulators. And we are talking to some in Washington State and Maryland, so 2 of the really big areas, and we know that activity is happening in areas like Texas, for example, and some others. So it's not as consistent in terms of the way the regulators are viewing this, and they have a much more open approach to the interpretation of regulatory rules. So we're not making as much progress on this particular area as I would have liked. But we are working with the CMMC. So this is the Cyber Maturity Model Assessment people. And again, that is massive. So this is the whole of the supply chain for the DoD. And the CMMC standards are now being talked about in many parts of Europe. There was a delegation that came to London that presented to the Joint Parliament Committee on Cybersecurity last week. and our relationship with the CMMC is significant. And I think if we can build that relationship, that has a much more wider implementation, and therefore I think we can utilise that to move forward with the regulators in the different states to start to put forward some of the ideas we've got about intelligence-led penetration testing. That there are other initiatives in the US, such as the Centre for Internet Security and the implementation of their standard, and both the CMMC and the CIS people are looking to CREST to help with the accreditation of companies and the certification of individuals to provide those services. So not as much on the regulator space, but I think that the level of influence through the DoD and some of the other government initiatives are really beginning to pay dividends. And I think Tom Brennan, who's our representative in the US, is again doing a fantastic job on our behalf.
That's great, thank you. So we've run a little bit over time, but I'd just like to ask this last question before we end. If there is any other questions that we haven't covered, apologies, and we're happy to pass those over to Ian, and I'm sure he will come back with an answer. So no problem for that. But this one, Ian, before we close, is there anything happening over in India at the moment?
India is a very big and strange market, so we are not actively talking to the regulators in India. We have been speaking to CERT India an awful lot, so there have been some quite detailed conversations with CERT India, and we have a huge amount of interest from individuals that want to sit our examinations and individuals and organisations that would like to work with us. We are doing work on the Indian continent, so we are working right now with the regulator in Pakistan and the Pakistani government to roll out cyber crime related activities, and they are actively talking to us about looking at some of the CBEST type implementations. But India, we haven't got a defined strategy for how we would move forward. But again, if people know more than I do, then please let us know. We have an awful lot of contacts in India. What we haven't done is to pull those together to actually deliver this in a consistent way.
That's great, thank you very much. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ian today for that really informative presentation. As I say, if you do have any other questions, then you can always contact us at CREST. That is no problem at all. And thank you very much to all the attendees that have taken the time out of their day to listen to the webinar. We have other webinars running throughout the day, so if you haven't had a chance to register for those, please feel free to get on those shortly. So take care. Thanks, Ian. Don't know if you've got any closing words to your audience.
No, not really, Debbie. I'd like to say thank you to both you and Ali for organising this. As always, it's running really well. And if the first two presentations, excluding mine, are anything to go by, I would strongly recommend that everybody listens to the rest of the day. It's been really informative and really good. So thank you very much, Debbie.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. And take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.